Good evening, guys. We'll get started with your review session. Your test tomorrow is going to be a 25-question test that you guys will be taking. Then we'll be able to have some time afterwards to be able to work on the 1960s. So we're able to get some stuff done before our partial days that happen the next 2 days with MCA testing taking place. We've got a few questions to work with, not a bunch, and so we'll be able to run through them all pretty quickly. So here we go. First question was asking you about Sweat versus Painter. This is a Supreme Court case that should be connected with the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, although Brown is going to be the much more famous of them. So Sweat versus Painter is going to be a case about the University of Texas with African-American students who are not being allowed into their graduate school for law. Sweat versus Painter is a court case arguing that the law school, by trying to create a separate school, was creating an unequal school, and the Supreme Court agreed with that. And so they ended up with a ruling that was separate and unequal schools, which is not fulfilling what was supposed to be fulfilled in Plessy versus Ferguson. We're going to do a lot more of a deep dive into that this upcoming week. So that court case was the one that inspired Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time outside of that, just one element to focus in on that. The next question is, what were Eisenhower's views of foreign policy? That's pretty much what we spent the week working on when we were working with the Cold War policies after Truman. So when we think about Truman's policies, he believes in containment. He's got his Truman Doctrine that we should be stepping in and helping out other countries that are facing insurgencies. He is very worried about starting World War III, and you're going to see that continue with Eisenhower. So Eisenhower is going to create what he calls his New Look policy, where he's trying to figure out ways to reduce the cost of the military so he can cut taxes and cut government spending. And so his feeling was you don't need to feed or clothe nuclear bombs like you do soldiers. So he's going to shrink the Army, the Navy, the Air Force as far as their size compared to his nuclear arsenal. He's going to put a lot of money into his Air Force, and he is going to very much connect them together with nuclear bombs, with the idea that we can engage in massive retaliation. And that's a term that you want to be able to use, that we're going to threaten Russia with our nukes and all of their allies as well. We're going to find, though, that after 1949, that's problematic because Russia has their own atomic weapons. But after 1949, America starts working on the hydrogen bomb, or the H-bomb, which is going to be much bigger than the atomic bomb that we had previously. So this is going to lead us into the era of MAD, mutually assured destruction, which will also be obviously problematic. His goal when he became president was to deal with the Korean conflict, and the way that he deals with that is by ending it. But we are going to have a number of foreign incursions that take place where you see Eisenhower trying to maintain the status quo. He is going to still maintain the Truman Doctrine, but he also puts into place the Eisenhower Doctrine, where he says the United States will go into any Middle Eastern country that we feel is threatened for its oil supply. We will then go into that country and protect our access to that cheap and easy oil. And so it's going to be that it gets us involved in a number of different circumstances, whether it's the Suez crisis or with the destabilization of Iran, where we remove Mossadegh, who is the democratic leader who's been flirting with the Soviet Union, and we instead replace him with the Shah of Iran, who becomes a hated dictator that creates a lot of the tensions that we still have in Iran currently. Eisenhower also embraces the same idea as Truman, where both of them see Israel as one of our closest allies in the Middle East, and that's going to become both a benefit for having an alliance in that area, but it also creates a lot of controversy and tension because of the fact that the neighbors around Israel are not thrilled of having Europeans and Americans thrust a new colony into the Middle East, especially in one of the holiest places in the Middle East, in the city of Jerusalem. So that's going to be an ongoing problem that we face. But that's the Eisenhower presidency. And then connecting that to the next question of what is the military-industrial complex, what we're going to discover is that a lot of the economic boom that we have in the 1950s is confused by a lot of modern-day Americans. A lot of modern-day Americans assume that we were great after World War II, and that's the reason why we're economically doing so well. But there's a combination of things that are going on. There's a decision that's made following World War II that we're going to move away from supply-side economics, which was the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover idea, and instead we're going to lower tariffs to make trade possible. And so you'll notice that they mention like GATT, G-A-T-T, which is the agreement on tariffs and trade that we have during the Truman presidency that is going to lower tariffs to try to encourage free trade. We're going to increase income taxes with the idea that it's going to give an incentive to business owners to not take so much of their profits and income, because it's going to run into a massive tax anyways, and so that money gets rolled into businesses. But a lot of our boom is happening not just because of those stimulative effects that are coming with a different sort of tax policy, but you also see a lot of New Deal sort of things floating through Eisenhower. The first is he creates massive building projects, especially the interstate highway system, which is built strictly as a military project, where you've got the idea of being able to get our troops from the East Coast to West Coast in a short amount of time. That's going to be a massive building project that's bigger than any other New Deal program. Plus, you also saw with NSC 68 a move where we quadrupled the amount of spending that we have on the military. So that's where we get into the military-industrial complex. When Eisenhower leaves in 1961, he gives the second most famous farewell address ever in U.S. presidential history, where he warns people to avoid the beware of the military-industrial complex. These are the people who are weapons manufacturers. In post-World War I, they were given the nickname merchants of death. And what Eisenhower is saying is, as a former general and now as a former president, he has watched as the military has now become very strong and gotten a huge budget, and there are now businesses that are selling massive amounts of weaponry to the United States government for massive amounts of money. And what Eisenhower is saying is that the military-industrial complex could be gaining way too much influence, because eventually the military is going to have enough weapons where they won't need to keep buying anymore unless they end up in a war with another country. And what Eisenhower's nervous about is these industrial contractors might put us into wars that are not needed for American security, but they might then generate a new need for more weapons. And so that's what he's warning us about with this military-industrial complex warning. The Landrum-Griffin Act in 1959, really super simple. It just makes the Taft-Hartley Act even more restrictive towards labor unions, and is specifically trying to deal with corruptions that are happening inside labor unions. There was a group of union members called Teamsters, and what we're going to see is that there are organized crime families that have been involved in like prohibition during the 1920s and 30s. They're now involved in like drugs and prostitution and gambling and all these other sorts of rackets. And one of these things that they start getting into is labor unions as well, trying to take advantage of the organizations for political clout, and then also to be able to skim off the union fees that they collect from these individuals. So recognizing that the unions, number one, have way too close of an affiliation with mobsters, and the most famous of those guys is Jimmy Hoffa, who at this time is going to run afoul of some gangsters, and after a meeting with one of them, he's going to disappear and nobody's ever going to see his body again. And also the feeling that there might be communists inside these labor unions. They put more strict rules on the ideas of having secret elections and other sorts of restrictions on labor unions so that they were not getting rolled up into criminal organizations. And so that's the Landrum-Griffin Act. Let me see here. The next question, Korean War, and it's asking about the main points of the Korean War. There are 4 different trends that you want to notice with the Korean conflict. Number 1, the invasion by North Korea into South Korea, surrounding MacArthur's troops in Pusan is going to be the first stage, and that's going to be an invasion that is aided by the Russians and the Chinese, who are sending weaponry to the North Koreans. The second stage that you'll want to notice is MacArthur leading the breakout that is going to allow an amphibious invasion at Incheon, while the South Koreans and the United Nations are able to push north, and then they're eventually going to get back to the 38th parallel. The third stage of that is then going to be MacArthur convincing Truman to invade North Korea. And Truman's under pressure to not look like he's appeasing communism, so he's going to go along with MacArthur, and this is going to risk a war with China. And when MacArthur gets up near the Yalu River at the northern part of Korea, and he faces an invasion of 300,000 Chinese soldiers, he's going to threaten China with an invasion. He's going to threaten them with nuclear bombs. And then Truman is going to fire MacArthur because he is getting too overzealous and threatening World War III. Back at home, a lot of conservatives who are more hawkish are going to celebrate MacArthur, and they're going to see Truman as an appeaser who is losing gained ground. But eventually what's going to happen is North Korea will be able to push down to the 38th parallel. Eisenhower will get elected with the idea of him fixing the Korean War, and shortly after he becomes president, he just decides to end the Korean War. That ending of the Korean War is going to end along the 38th parallel. It's going to create something called a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone, and then the war will come to a ceasefire, but it's still been going on since that time period. So our Winter Olympics that we just had was in a war zone, even though they haven't been shooting at each other officially for the past 50 years. Next question, what was McCarthyism? McCarthyism was what we were paying attention to in the documentary that I released to you, where you see Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, who is a congressman who becomes a very aggressive attacker of any sort of hints of communism inside the United States. His accusations are going to get more wild and reckless until eventually he starts accusing people in the military of being potential communists, and that's going to bring the ire of Dwight D. Eisenhower, a lot of other people in Congress. Both McCarthyism and the HUAC are going to take two different paths. For people who are conservatives who are worried about communism, they see both of those trends as being legitimate because of the fact that they do root out communist trends, whether it's Alger Hiss or the Rosenbergs. There are people who are found who are doing things that are suspicious of communism or actually are espionage and making them nervous. On the other side, there are many people who see the HUAC and McCarthyism as being a demonstration of a kangaroo court where Congress is acting as a judge, jury, and executioner of people's public personas, where people are getting blacklisted, punishment, arrested for contempt of court, with a House hearing that's supposed to be investigative about trying to figure out how to write good bills, and instead that gets turned into a court of law. So for the few communists we find, a bunch of people find their careers ruined because of the aggressiveness that's taking place with these guys and the disregard that's going on for a lot of civil liberties because of the fact that they feel like the end justifies the mean in tracking down communists. Let me see. What were the Nuremberg war crimes trials? Nuremberg and then the Tokyo trials are just the trials that are put on post-World War II to punish German Nazi Nazi old officers in Nuremberg, and then Tokyo Japanese officers for war crimes that they were committing during the war itself. Next question, why was the fair deal important? The fair deal is important because it's an attempt by Truman during peacetime to carry on the ideals of the New Deal and actually spread it further. He wanted to expand more Social Security. He wanted to create a nationwide health insurance program similar to what Obamacare has turned into recently. He's got a lot of other programs that are meant to create safety nets and help for people who are struggling inside of our society. And the feeling in most of society is that we've already come to the point where we've got enough recovery going on. There are a lot of people who are afraid that this will be creeping socialism or creeping communism. And so in the Congress, you have Republicans and Southern Democrats who are very nervous about the fair deal. So the reason why we know it is to compare it to what was going on with the New Deal, but also recognize that when there's not a Great Depression going on, a lot of Americans aren't excited about the idea of increasing government programs greatly to try to address problems that are still existing. The next question is about Sputnik. Sputnik is going to be our focus when we start getting into our new content. But Sputnik is just the first orbital device that's shot into the atmosphere and outside the atmosphere into outer space. And it's just a little ball that flies above the planet, and it's giving off a radio frequency so that you can pick up the beeping that's going on as Sputnik spins around the planet. And so this is the indication that America is slipping behind. So as a result of Sputnik, Eisenhower is going to ramp up our space race. You'll notice our school was built in 1970. It's one of the wave of schools that are built using NDEA funds and other sorts of monies. So the National Defensive Education Act is going to be trying to figure out ways to build up science, math schools to try to help us develop enough scientists so we can then compete with the Russians, who seem to be outpacing us. This will also be the reason why we create NASA. And like I said, we'll dive more deeply into that this upcoming week as we start taking a look at the Kennedy presidency and the Apollo program. The kitchen debate super simple with that one. Nixon was our vice president with Eisenhower, and he was eager to try to show people that he was good at foreign policy for the hope of possibly becoming president himself when he ran against Kennedy in 1960. And so what happened was we had a trip that Nixon took over to Russia, where he was in Russia in 1960, and he was in a kind of World's Fair sort of space. And they'd created a display to show what an American kitchen looked like. And while they were touring that, Nixon and Khrushchev got into a debate about what was better, communism or democracy and capitalism. And this was all televised. And when it was done, Nixon was able to stand toe-to-toe with Khrushchev and not make him mad, but both made their points eloquently. And Nixon very much came off as a statesman in spite of his young age. It looked like he could hold his own against Nikita Khrushchev, and so that really elevated his stature as a result of that. Next question is about unions. One is about Taft-Hartley. The Taft-Hartley Act is just an act that's meant to put some limitations on the labor union gains that were created by the Wagner Act. And so there were some limitations on like what sort of closed shops could be created where you couldn't have people who were not in the union. They had some limitations on the union power itself. And so this was very much seen as an attempt to try to weaken unions. Truman vetoed this bill, but people in Congress, Republican and Southern Democrat, are going to be able to overcome that veto. And so we're going to see the unions start weakening then. Landrum Act is going to start to weaken them even further. So we're going to see unions hit their peak in the 1950s, and they've been declining ever since that time period. Operation Dixie was an attempt by Northern Union leaders, especially the CIO, to try to convince Southerners that they should start creating labor unions as well, because they were getting paid very poorly. They were struggling to get better gains with pay and benefits. But what they found is when they tried to go into the South, number one, a lot of the jobs in the South were not heavily skilled, and so it was really hard to mobilize a union. Secondarily, a lot of the jobs were service jobs that were hard to unionize as well. And then thirdly, a lot of Southerners were very nervous about unions as being havens of communists, socialists, gangsters, and so on. And so the union effort really died out at that time. And so we're going to see then as a reflex, there are a lot of northern businesses that realize that if they want to operate cheaper, they could hire workers in the South, take their factory from the North, in a place that we now know as the Rust Belt, where they had really big factories in the turn of the century. But by this point, the factories are aging, and rather than rebuilding, a lot of these factories are going to move out of the North. They're going to move down to the South, where they have an anti-union trend, and they'll hire non-unionized workers for cheaper pay, cheaper benefits, which is going to then lower a lot of standards of living for people in the North as their jobs disappear. And while people in the South are going to get jobs, they aren't nearly the pay and benefits that people were getting in the North. So we're going to find that it's a net positive for businesses, but not so much for the workers. The next slam that's going to happen, though, is no matter how cheap the American workers are in the South, there's cheaper workers still outside the country. So we're going to see a second move happening in the 1980s, 1990s, as many of these factories move out of the United States and overseas to other countries. Let me see here. Next question, what provoked the Cold War? The best thing to think about with that is that race between the United States and Russia as they met in the middle in World War II in the middle of Germany. When Russia took over that territory, they gave all sorts of promises to Roosevelt and Roosevelt and Truman, that they were going to be allowing self-determination and democratic elections. But once they got power, the Russians didn't decide to do that. They decided to extend their sphere of influence, create what was called the Iron Curtain, or the Soviet bloc. And as a result, those countries then were not independent, and the Americans and the British and the French realized that the Russians were becoming expansionistic. They were expanding there. They were looking at Greece and Turkey. They were looking at places in the Middle East. And so it's this expansion that is very much setting off the Americans, the French, and the British. And especially after engaging in appeasement, there's a feeling that they cannot appease, but they also can't attack head on, because Russia has by far the largest land army left in Europe. And so if you aggravate them, they could overrun all of Western Europe, much like Adolf Hitler did. And really the only thing protecting the West is that atomic weapon threat that the United States has. And so this is what's going to create the standoff initially, and then once both sides get their atomic weapons, and eventually nuclear weapons, this is going to lead to MAD, mutually assured destruction, where you can't attack the enemy because if you do, you'll just end up vaporizing the planet. So that's where the Cold War comes from, is that battle over what's happening in Central Europe. And then you see it extended into places like Korea and Vietnam and Cuba. And we call those things proxy wars, Proxy, where these are not the direct wars of Russia versus the United States, but it is going to be battles over what's taking place with the spread of communism compared to capitalism and democracy. Let me see here. Next question was about Iran's leadership change with the CIA. And as far as whether or not that's important, what you should notice with that video that I showed you is notice that there's a number of different places around the world, whether it's in Guatemala or Nicaragua or in Iran or other sorts of places, where the CIA at this point, it's very much the end justifies the means. We're going to announce to the world that we're the good guys, but then we've also got our spy agency, the CIA, going into places and doing things like covert wars, black ops, coups, and other sorts of things that we claim only the bad Russians do. But we're playing a hardball with the Russians, and we're using the same techniques. And so we very much believe that the end justifies the means, where we're doing things that we claim only bad people would be doing. And this is going to be what makes it very difficult then to negotiate in the future, where Americans themselves will have the idea that we're just inside the 50 states. Why would anybody ever get mad at us? We are always the good guys who are supporting democracy and freedom and liberty. Whereas around the world, they're very acquainted with the idea that America is willing to do some extra legal sort of stuff in order to maintain either their oil supply because of the Eisenhower Doctrine, or else to stop the spread of communism with the Truman Doctrine. And we'll see that even get more messy in the 1960s as a result. Let me see here. What was the significance of Sweat versus Painter? We already got that one. What was Nixon's checker speech? You saw it if you watched the video lecture that I set up for you for America, the post-war years. That was the speech that Eisenhower forced Nixon to give on TV to prove that he wasn't crooked. He was accused of taking bribes from his campaign funds. And he claimed eventually that the only illegal campaign contribution they got was the gift of a dog from somebody in Texas, and the dog's name was Checkers. And if you check out that video, it's incredible watching what Nixon is up to, because we do know after the fact that he had some shady stuff going on with his finances. But it's one of the first attempts to try to create a broad appeal through the use of television to maintain somebody's credibility, and we see Nixon do it fantastically. Waves of telegrams come into the Eisenhower campaign telling Eisenhower not to fire Nixon because he's such a good guy. Let me see. For the test tomorrow, will the Vietnam War be as significant as the Korean War? The only thing you need to know about for the war tomorrow for the Vietnam conflict is the Eisenhower part of it. And the Eisenhower part of it's really simple. Vietnam originally was a French colony in the late 1800s, early 1900s. When Japan spread outwards, they took over territory. So when we were watching our World War II lecture, you saw Japan expand into what was called French Indochina. That's known as Vietnam nowadays, and Cambodia and Laos. After World War II, the French moved back in. But unfortunately for the French, they're running into an independence movement. So while the French are being colonial and anti-communist, inside of Vietnam, there's a guy named Ho Chi Minh who's being nationalistic, and he also decides to be communist, largely because he has gotten not a lot of help from the Europeans or from the Americans in his independence movement, but he is getting some sympathy from the Russians in his attempts to try to make his country independent. And so what's going to happen is the French are going to start running low on resources, on energy, and then following Dien Bien Phu, which is the only battle you really need to know from that time period. It's a point in northern Vietnam where the French government decided to set up a gigantic military base to try to attract the North Vietnamese in like one final armed battle that the French were certain they would win. And instead, the French get clobbered, and so they get blown out at Dien Bien Phu. And then they announce to the Americans, kind of like we had with Greece and Turkey with the Truman Doctrine. The French announced, we're not protecting Vietnam anymore. If you want to stop the spread of communism, you're going to have to be the ones who are pumping money and effort into that space. So in 1958, Eisenhower starts sending aid to South Vietnam. And then the North Vietnamese are very much communists who want to unite the entire country. The other term you'll want to know about for that is known as the domino theory or the domino effect, with the idea that if you allow a country to turn to communism like in Vietnam, the feeling is that then Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines, Japan, all of them will topple to communism as you allow the dominoes to start falling. So you can't allow that to take place by sitting conflicts out. And so that would be seen as a form of appeasement. And so that's going to be very much what drags Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson into the Vietnam conflict, especially being good Democrats. They have to be very much vigilant for the accusation that they're being soft on communism. So this is very much ratcheting up that Cold War tension where both Republicans and Democrats are forcing each other to keep upping the involvement to make sure that communism isn't winning. I see no more questions, so I'm assuming that we are good. Hopefully you guys are as well. Like I mentioned, 25 question test tomorrow, and then that'll leave us time for us to be able to do other sorts of things. For us this week, we will only be working with the stuff from the 1960s, so the end of chapter 36, and then chapter 37 is both this week and next week. And then when we go into spring break, we should hopefully then have all of our 1960s done. And then if we're left with the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, we're in a really good place when it comes to get ready for the AP test. If you have any questions, feel free to email at this point. Unfortunately, I do not have access to Schoology because I have been frozen out for the evening, but I'm hoping to have that fixed up by tomorrow morning. And so I hope you guys do great. Enjoy your night, and I'll see you tomorrow.